so what did we do before the break? Yeah, so now's a good time to do a review. So what do we do in order? So the first thing we did was we wanted to create a new Rails app. And pretty much anywhere on the terminal, we can type Rails, where'd it go? Rails new something something, and it'll create us a new folder. Hang on, yeah, there we go. So to create a new Rails app, we do Rails new something something, and it always creates a new folder. So you always need to remember to cd into it, but after that you're ready to go. Rails new on its own doesn't do like anything. You don't really get an end result. It just gives you the placeholders ready for you to fill in the details. But it does quite a lot of that. It creates a lot of things for you, like the gem file and all the folders. So, very handy. To create content, there are generators which will create views and models and migrations for you, and are very helpful, but you don't need to use them. You can create it all manually by hand if you want. But that said, if you want to just create a standard item with create and index and show and such like, it's a great choice. We'll talk a bit eventually about when to choose one or the other, but in the beginning, either is totally valid. Okay. So the generator, we told it was to create a post. Resource, I guess, is the word. And did multiple steps. It created us did the database table creation for us by making a migration. It created a model for us. It put a routes into the routes folder and created a bunch of views for us. That sentence on its own doesn't make a lot of sense unless we know what controllers and routes and views are. So Rails, when we go to the browser and we ask for a page, for example, if we look for featured, the process it goes through is first, so the browser has asked us for an URL. First it goes to the routes file and looks through each of the items until it finds a match, and that match will tell it what controller and what action within the controller should do the work. And a controller is the code for each page, and each page has its own action, and it's just a function with Ruby in it that at the end has to decide what template or what HTML should be rendered. They're grouped by model, like cars controller and post controller. Everything in post goes in post controller. But that's not strongly enforced. You can change that if you want, or you can have a controller that brings everything in if you really want. But that said, it's good to keep the standard structure. And the standard structure is your index and your show and your new and your edit and create actions, the same as we had in Sinatra. And that was why we did that, why we had those strange names in Sinatra, so that when we hit this, we knew what they were. We can create our own actions. It's just a new function. Inside you can do any Ruby code you like, and then render whatever template you like. If you don't tell it to render a template, so for example in published we told it we want to render the index. In index we don't, because Rails will automatically render the template with the same name as the action. So if we go to post controller index action, it will look in views posts index. Which brings me to another point, which is that Rails kind of enforces the folder structure. Most of the important stuff goes in app. So for example, controllers go in controllers, views go in views, models go in models. And that keeps everything very, very tidy. I think that's most of everything that we mentioned. The views are the same as Sinatra. They're still ERB. They have a slightly different naming structure in that it's html.erb. But for the most part, for example, the layout follows the same concept. The layout in Sinatra and the layout in Rails is the same, that you have a chunk that says yield, and that's where it puts the other template. so that's a good review. So maybe I'll cover the last few bits of the tour, because there's a few like boring bits, almost things to ignore. For example, anything in bin, log, test, temp, vendor, git ignore, rake file, config.ru, you can totally ignore. I'm going to put those up on a list on Google Drive later on. But again, this is something that happens organically, that if you don't have a reason to look in them, you don't have to worry about it really. Like if you want to add HTML, you know it's in the views, so you go into views. But you never really have a reason to go into temp. It's just where it stores the kind of junk, like the cache and things. So for the most part, until you need to use a part of Rails, you can pretty much just ignore it entirely. Like I think I've changed config.ru maybe once in 3 years. So I just ignore it most of the time. Config obviously stores all of the configuration stuff. It has a whole bunch of different places to put settings depending on what context they're used in. For the most part, you decide where to put it based on what like documentation says. Like if you load up a new gem, it will say, okay, go to this file and put in this code. So you don't really have to worry like what is the difference. It's mostly the instructions will tell you which one. Some of them do have specific purposes, like database.yaml is everything to do with the database. We're still using SQLite 3, so this is it telling it this is where the file will be. Again, don't worry about the syntax until you need to change it. You can kind of just ignore it. So yeah, basically anything to do with configuration goes in config. Bin can be ignored. And anything to do with the database goes in DB. So there's the migrations that we've created, there's the actual database file. Schema is just like what does it think the structure of the database is, but you can mostly ignore that as well. And seeds you can totally ignore. So yeah, again, you can totally ignore stuff until you need it. Alright, so I guess there's a couple of last things. One is CSS. So I want to add some CSS to the site, because maybe I want to make this be red. Rails does this with a bit of magic in that unless you tell it not to, it automatically loads all of the style sheets in app asset style sheets for you. So I don't have to tell it to load the files. I can just go straight into cars and do H1 color red. And hopefully it goes red. That's a little bit weird. Actually, okay, so maybe round about this for a bit. So there's a few important things to know about this. So it loads them automatically, and it just loads them in order. So you don't really have to put stuff to do with cars in cars and posts in posts. You can put them in any order in any file. Yeah, so you can, to be honest, if you have a small site, just have a single one called styles.css. I'll explain the SCSS thing in a second. Okay, so what are the important things with that? Actually, I'm going to write this down. I have a bunch of notes. They're not on Drive yet, but they will get there shortly. CSS notes. Okay, everything in app assets gets loaded automatically in alphabetical order. And the generator created for me a cars.scss. Oh, I see, I don't need that. But I don't have to use it. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't matter if this H1 color red is in cars or in posts.
Okay.
You can put them in. Obviously, you need to put it in some manner that is tidy for you, but like Rails doesn't enforce it.
Okay. Like you would use, for example, h1.cars or something like that? From classes for different. If you for some reason to make cars look different.
Yeah, something like cars table H1 or something. So it's still up to you to structure your CSS in a way that's tidy and doesn't overlap on stuff. But it gives you the beginning of a structure. Actually, yeah, so let's do that. So open up your application layout, which is in app views layouts application. And just before the style sheet link tag, put in an HTML comment. It says style start here. And one after that says styles end here. And then when you go to the browser, reload it and do view page source and look for those tags that you just put in before and after the style sheet link tag. And what you see in the middle, it looks a little crazy because the weird number in the middle, but it's just a normal link. So link rel style sheet, href assets cars .css. So aside from the fact that it's given these CSS files crazy names and this weird data turbolinks thing, which we can ignore for now, it's just a totally normal CSS link tag. And the point of that is that this line is like replacing itself with the style sheets. Like this style sheet link tag thing is what tells it, go to assets, go to the style sheets and load them all and replace yourself with what you find there. Which means by the time it gets to the browser, it just sees normal CSS link tags and doesn't think anything weird is happening. Can I open one of these up? So if I look at so I just clicked on the assets posts blah 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 .css. I'll explain the number thing in a second as well. And when I got that, it's just a normal CSS file with normal CSS. Aside from the magic style sheet link tag, everything to the browser looks normal. Alright, a few things that we can ignore are these data turbolink things. Come back to them, and the number is kind of like version number. So again, you don't need to worry about it too much. But every time you change the file, it will change this number just to really tell the browser, like, this is a new version, make sure you download it, don't keep the old one. But again, we'll come back to that. Okay, so summary of CSS, it's just totally normal. We put the CSS into style sheets. I'll come back to SCSS in a second, and it will auto-load them. The SCSS thing is is like a fancier version of CSS. Don't need it just yet. We will get to it eventually, but it's like CSS with more features, actually. you can put totally normal CSS into an SCSS file and it will just carry on like nothing is different. Learn CS? Where is the example? It lets you do some cool things like having variables. Like you can set the color for the main color of the site once and then reuse it 100 times through the site. And you can nest stuff, which just makes your code a bit more readable. So it's just added features. So again, we'll come back to it. You don't need to worry about it just yet. It's just so you know it's just CSS, but more so. But on the other hand, that means don't ever screw with this line until or don't screw with it unless you know what you're doing. Because what happens occasionally is people delete it and then they go, hey, why is my CSS not working? And then we spend 10 minutes trying to figure it out and they're like, oh wait, maybe I shouldn't have deleted that. So basically just ignore this line entirely. Or trust that it's going to print out the CSS, but for the most part you don't need to change it.
Which CSS file should we focus on there?
I think probably the best one is just to create your own and shove it all in there. Oh, actually the other one is never, oh yeah, hang on, I'm gonna write this down. I forgot one last thing. Don't fiddle with application.css until you've figured it out. Because that has the same problem. If I empty application.css, the magical auto-loading stops working. So, my suggestion is probably actually to delete the ones, maybe this one as well. I'll come back to scaffolds in a second. Delete all of them except application CSS, create your own one, and then just fill that in. And come up with your own structure. Scaffolds CSS is, it's like built-in basic stuff. Like remember when we did the validations, it had a big red box. That's just the line that tells it you should be red. So you can delete scaffolds if you want. It just has some like basic default, like the background color should be this, the body color should be that. It's nothing really interesting. It's nice to have, but you can get rid of it. And now it's back. Okay. What next? The same applies to JavaScript, but we'll come back to that in the future. Oh, I know. I'm trying to think how to make this more exciting. It's all got a bit like technical. Alright, a couple of last things to show. I don't know, wait. Well, I don't know. How bored are you? I don't know. I feel like it's very theoretical at the moment. Right? If that's okay, we can keep doing that.
I mean, what would be good maybe if we could get something to try to do something ourselves, like something easy, like add, I don't know. Yeah, yeah, maybe like APIs, was that too early to do yet?
Way too early. APIs are like a whole extra, or it's more like how do I mix, or it's like APIs are a topic, and then just how do I connect it with Rails
Yeah,
is
exactly.
the chunk.
Okay.
I mean, we could do how do I create another page, but it's probably going to be identical to the example I showed you.
Okay.
Well, I don't know, let's do that anyway. Alright, find me a keyboard. I'll do the group codey thing. You go first, just for a laugh. Oh, is there a mouse? Does Jonas have it? Is there a
on the map.
Big training, just use
Oh.
just use the keyboard.
I think you have I think the mouse and the keyboard are back to front. So this is working. Oh wait, does the keyboard still work? Oh, maybe this is not such a good idea. Okay, we don't have a mouse, so maybe this is not gonna work.
Okay.
Okay, anyway, maybe let's ditch that plan temporarily. Alright, back to the original. Okay, we'll figure that out tomorrow. Okay, so there's only 20 minutes left, so maybe I'll just wrap up the last couple of things. So there's a couple more odd bits, neat bits. So features that Rails gives you that we can reuse later. And one is, where did it go? So remember I got you guys to make these helper things, the URL helpers? Where are the other ones? Do I have any other ones? Oh yeah, okay. So instead of putting all of the URLs into the templates by hand, we built helpers to generate them for us. One thing that is neat with Rails is that because we have everything in a routes file, so we told the routes file everything there is to know about the URLs. It's in charge of like when the browser goes to one URL, this controller action should handle it. But vice versa, that means it knows how to create an URL to that page. So let's maybe just jump to the layout for the moment. And link to. I want to tell it, I want a link, just build me a link to the first post. I don't want to worry about how you're doing it, just make it happen. And the first section is what will the text of the link be. And yeah, so that goes into the application layout, anywhere in the page. And it gives me a link to the first post. And this one is a bit more magic than the helpers that we were using. And that we didn't even tell it like, give me the URL to this, it was like build the entire link. But if I do a view source, it's just putting out the normal /post/1. And that's quite cool. And it becomes really cool later on when you've got like give me a link to the comments for the first post or something, or like give me a link to the first comment of the first post by the first user. You guys don't need to do this, I'll just show you it. If I run the rake routes command, it tells me all of the URLs that it knows about. Where did that go? So it knows I can go to /post ID and it will bring me to post/show. It's also built one for that URL that we created. So the published posts. So let's add a link to that as well. Link, oops. What was it? Post published. And I'm not sure how much detail I want to go into at this point. I'll have to think about that for a second. Actually, I'll just show something in a second. Okay, so did everybody get that working?
Well, that makes more sense to have featured.
Oh, it's published, not featured, I guess.
So the link to is defined somewhere, I think. So it's post published.
Yes. This is the bit I'm not sure how much to explain right now, or whether to leave it for later. I think I'll leave it for later, because there's a few different variations on how this link to can be used, and it just takes a little while to talk about. But the gist is that you, instead of creating the URL yourself, you say like, I want a link to this thing, and you can give it more or less clues, and then it gives you back an URL. And so, just as an example, go to your routes file and change this posts published to posts, I don't know, recently published. Change this bit on the left. And then if you go back to, I guess oh, okay, that broke. Right, well that didn't work the way I expected. Well, okay, no, ignore that bit. The idea, I picked a bad example. When you've built these URLs correctly, it gives you the ability to change the URL here, and then it changes everywhere on the site. So if you ever need to rename something, instead of having to change the 600,000 times you put /post/blah, you change it once here and it knows to change it all the other places. My example is rubbish and it would have made me change it, so let's not do it. But that's the general idea. So you'll see a lot in the examples. You'll see that in various examples a lot. It's using link to, and that's what it's doing. It's saying, instead of you manually doing a href equals blah, it's saying, route system, I've got this random post from somewhere because the controller did something that I don't really know what, but it gave me back a post at the end. Gave me a link. Or, better yet, say I'm in the posts index, and I have the controller grabbed all of the posts, and now I want to do the link to each post. I just say, hey, give me a link to that post, or get me a link to the edit page for that post. And that kind of cuts down on the amount of like thinking and remembering that we have to do. Because you could still stick with the ahref thing, and it'd be fine. It's just for complex URLs, it gets a bit annoying.
Okay. Yeah, as long as we know that it really does change everything and it doesn't, I mean, as long as you can track of what it changes and when, when you can trace, okay, have you made a mistake? When, for example, did you change any manually or you changed something and then you changed the one of the routes, then will it not change that other manually changed one? I mean, for example.
Some of them, yeah, it's a bit of a bummer. It's not completely flawless, or not like, or it will still let you create errors sometimes. So you do still need to test stuff, which is it can cause problems, but it makes it a lot easier than if you do it by hand. Or the other thing is, at least it will explode instead of just silently failing. If you forget to change one of them when you're doing it the old way, users will just see a blank page saying, hey, I don't work. At least with the route system, it will explode and go, hey, this isn't even totally valid at all. And you'll hopefully see that error. Okay, so that's the link to. And the last thing is the forms. I'm not going to explain how they work yet. It's mostly just to show you that they're crazy. Okay, let's just compare briefly to the Sinatra ones. Can I make this work? Alright, so let's look at the top bit. Or let's go line by line. I'm going to just go line by line and then come back and explain. So we have form action, post create, and then suddenly we have form for. And this is not Ruby, this is just plain HTML. But suddenly we have Ruby instead. And they're both doing the same thing. We'll come back to how later. We have if post errors any, blah 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 blah, print out the messages. If post errors any, print out the messages. So that bit's the same. The bit where it gets a little weird is when we start to do the inputs. So I have a label for the title and then an input type text name title. And instead, this is again, it does some Ruby that prints out the text field title. And let's just look at the browser to compare again. Page source. So we have weird Ruby here that says text area body, but by the time it gets to the browser, it's back to normal. It's just a normal HTML thing. And so again, something for more detail will come later, but that's just what that's doing. It's a line of Ruby code that creates the form for us. And the main reason for that is for the validations. Oh, well, I deleted the CSS. Oh, actually, will it? No, let's do. Yeah, there we go. Actually, yeah, so remember we had to do this like value equals blah to when we had the form and we had validations and we submitted it but we failed the validations. We wanted to remember the old values. So we had to put in a line saying, if you have a value, print it out. Whereas the Rails one doesn't. It just says, hey, do the thing for the title. And that's why it's doing it that way. We tell it in Ruby code, give me the field for the title, and then it figures out all of those details of remembering the existing values. I think there should be a class on it now. I foolishly deleted the scaffolds, but if it was still there, class fields with errors, it told that to be red. So around any field that has errors, it gives it a class so we can make it more obvious to the user. So that's the summary of what the form helpers are. They're doing the same thing as we did manually, but in a much more distant way that we kind of tell it, print out the form, and then it figures out the details. Yeah, we'll go into it in more detail again and again. But again, it's one of those things, you kind of just copy it from the previous one. If you want to create a new one, you just look at what I did last time and go, okay, make sure it works the same. Alright, and I think that's the tour of Rails, really. The reason why I wanted to make it more fun was because if it gets too theory, it all just kind of like blurs. And I've kind of in an abstract way told you why all this stuff is good, but it's not so obvious until you try and like make your own things. So that's where we're aiming for in a couple of days' time, that we could say, okay, each of you pick an idea for a site and make it yourself. Alright. So then to close. So there's a big tour of Rails. There was a lot of detail there. A lot of detail. So you definitely won't pick it up first time. If you did the Rails guide already, now would be maybe an interesting time to like reread it briefly. Like just to kind of flick through it and go, well, so if you haven't done it, do it. You don't have to, I guess, but it's worthwhile. And if you've already done it, to kind of reread it briefly and go, okay, Rails new blog, what was that doing? And then like step by step, like just look at what they did, and hopefully it will make more sense now because you've got the context. And that's why you can just read through it quickly. You don't need to read like super detailed, but just to kind of see if it puts the pieces together. And if you really want, do the same thing with the Odin project. So again, we're going to be more lessons and exercises tomorrow. But if you get bored this evening and want to do something, actually, if you get bored this evening, probably this one is a good one. Because I see they talk about web stuff as well. But it depends if you're into reading or more like video or whatever.